I'm gonna be honest with you. I'm not feeling so good. I got a bottle right here and it had wine in it, and now it doesn't have any wine in it. But I gotta make this video, so I'm gonna do that. So I have a list of like 30 video ideas that I plan on doing in the future of all kind of cool stuff, like a cyberpunk video, a Blue Eye Samurai video I was planning on doing, a video on the new God of War Valhalla DLC. Point is, this video idea was not on there. I decided to do this after my attempt of doing my due diligence as a video creator, as a creator of videos, as a video creator, because I went through all the comments on my last video and read all of them and tried to reply to all of them. But there's like over 200 and it's incredibly time consuming, far more time consuming than I thought it would be. So in case you were wondering if your comment did not get read, it absolutely did get read. It may not have gotten responded to, but I do read all the comments. Anyway, in those comments, there's a lot of talk and arguing and confusion and a lot of really good conversation as well, but it all seems to be revolving around one thing, and that is no one knows what a protagonist is. Now, I usually see rules of the English language as well as definitions in general as more of suggestions than like hard and fast rules. But since I decided to make a video about the rules of storytelling, it's probably for the best that I clearly get across exactly what I mean when I say protagonist, antagonist, villain, hero, main character, etc., etc. I understand that if you're just talking with friends out in the world, that a protagonist is essentially just a shorthand for main character. But if you're a writer and you take a lot of creative writing classes or film classes or any really storytelling classes whatsoever, you know that that's not true. And this is partially my fault because in the True Protagonist of Tekken video, I did not explain what I meant by protagonist. So I guess you can kind of consider this not necessarily a sequel to that video, but like a DLC, like Phantom Liberty or Undead Nightmare. That was a really good DLC. So if you haven't seen that video, you can go back and watch that video and then be a little bit confused because it doesn't exactly tell you what a protagonist is, and then come back to this video that tells you what a protagonist is and retroactively explains what you needed to know in that video. Or if you want, you can watch this video, having absolutely no context for that video, and then when you go back and watch that video, it's like a mind game where you have to piece all the information together. I didn't think this through very well. This video's fucked. Let's just start. One, it's going to explain what a protagonist is in detail and compare it and contrast it to what a main character is and what a hero is. Number two, I'm going to respond to certain comments that I saw and try to alleviate some of that confusion. And number three, I'm going to correlate these definitions to the Tekken franchise and explain how certain characters fit certain roles within the story. Also, let me know if this is stuff that you guys are even interested in. Do y'all like me going through all the comments and making videos kind of responding to you guys in this sort of interactive way that I'm doing right now? Or would you guys prefer that I didn't linger and I just sort of moved on to the next thing and just made a video on the next topic? I mean, damn, I don't know. I'm new at this whole YouTube thing. I'm just kind of making it up as I go along. So what is the difference between a protagonist, a main character, and a hero? This is where most of the confusion seems to lie. A protagonist is a character whose actions move the plot forward. That's it. That's as simple as it gets. Any argument you want to give for a character being the protagonist that does not include that definition is a wrong argument. It doesn't matter if they defeat the final bad guy. It doesn't matter how much time they're on screen. It doesn't matter if they're a hero or a villain. None of that stuff is relevant. It is as simple as the character whose actions forward the plot. That's it. There were so many arguments in the comments of that video that had absolutely nothing to do with what a protagonist is. Many people were arguing that the protagonist had to be a good guy or at the very least have some kind of positive traits. Really? Tell that to American Psycho, Nightcrawler, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, There Will Be Blood, Casino. I can go on. There's tons of stories about characters that are not good people, that are just straight up evil, and they fill the role as protagonists. People were saying that Jin's the protagonist because he's defeated the most bosses at the very end of the game. He defeated Ogre, Jinpachi, Azazel, and because of this, he must be the protagonist. Since when does the protagonist have to defeat the main villain? So a bit of a spoiler warning, I'm about to spoil some pretty great movies right now. In No Country for Old Men, the protagonist, Llewellyn Moss, doesn't even meet the villain of the movie. He dies like 25 minutes before the end of the movie, and he never gets to see him. That doesn't strip him of his protagonist title. In The Departed, Leonardo DiCaprio, the main character, gets killed like 10 or 15 minutes before the end of the movie, and both of the villains of the movie get killed by other people. One of them gets killed by a supporting character. Marky Mark does not suddenly become the protagonist of the movie just because he got to kill the bad guy. There were two separate comments on that video comparing my argument to Mario. If a protagonist is just a character that moves the plot forward, then isn't Bowser the protagonist since he kidnapped Princess Peach and kicked off the plot? No, he is not, because the plot of Mario is not about kidnapping Princess Peach. The plot of Mario is to save Princess Peach. The plot of a story does not start on page 1. It starts with an inciting incident that is usually caused by an outside factor. The plot of Mario does not start until Bowser kidnaps Princess Peach. That then forces Mario to go save Princess Peach. that kicks off the plot. And Mario is the character that makes every action in the game towards the end goal of that plot. There was another argument doing basically the same thing, but with Green Goblin, saying that Green Goblin is the protagonist of Spider-Man, based on my definition because his actions push the plot forward. Again, like my Bowser example, the plot of Spider-Man is not for Green Goblin to get revenge on his business partners and cause chaos throughout New York City. The plot of the movie is to stop Green Goblin and to hook up with MJ. The character who pushes that plot forward is Spider-Man. The reason why these arguments come up is because people don't know the difference between story and plot. The plot is a writer's tool. It's essentially what happens in a story. In something like Star Wars, it's as simple as Luke Skywalker overthrows the Empire. It's what the movie is about. The story is how the plot happens. So getting trained by Obi-Wan, meeting Han Solo, meeting Leia, fighting Darth Vader, all of these things are a part of the story. The antagonist, Darth Vader, is capable of taking actions that further the story, but he cannot take actions that further the plot and still remain an antagonist, which is actually exactly what happens. He does help further the plot by killing the Emperor, no longer being an antagonist from that point on. There was also a lot of confusion with people thinking that I was saying that the character who has the goals is the protagonist, and no, goals don't matter. Any character can have goals. Every character can have goals in your whole story. What's important is the character's actions, not the goals that they have. Every story for the most part has one plot, one main plot that the whole story is about. The character that makes the actions that push that plot forward is the protagonist, regardless and completely separate from what his goals are. Generally speaking, in most stories, their goals are the plot of the story. Like them going towards whatever that goal is a thing that makes them the protagonist, but that's not necessarily always the case. Their goal can be something completely unrelated to the main plot, and then them commit actions that push the plot forward out of happenstance, and they would still qualify as a protagonist. And supporting characters and villains can also have goals without them becoming the protagonist. The main character is the character by which we experience the story through. Generally speaking, the main character is the one who is affected by the conflict the most. This is the character that we follow through the story, and we see the story play out through this character's eyes. While a hero is a virtuous character that has to overcome some kind of challenge. That challenge doesn't necessarily have to be evil or malicious in nature. It could be like a tornado or something. They just have to work towards overcoming something. That's what makes them different from just normal virtuous characters who aren't heroes. Now, I absolutely understand why these three are confused. In like 90-95% of stories, these three are the exact same thing. The hero, the main character, and the protagonist are all the same person. That's the majority of stories, but that doesn't mean that they have to be. You can have a protagonist who is not a main character or a hero. You can have a main character who is not a hero or a protagonist. You can have a hero who's not a protagonist or a main character. They are different, even though they do align quite a bit. But one film that I like to use that is the quintessential example of how these three things are not the same is City of God. If you haven't seen City of God, go watch City of God. It is an absolutely amazing film. This movie breaks every single rule of storytelling it possibly can, and it still comes out being really great. So City of God takes place in Rio de Janeiro during a massive gang war that was going on in the 1960s and 70s, and it's told through the eyes of Rocket, who is a real-life person who eventually grows up to become a journalist that covered this whole story. Rocket is the main character. He is the person who we experience the entire story through. It starts with him and ends with him, and we get his perspective on pretty much everything that happens in the movie. However, he's not the protagonist. He's a character that takes no actions towards the main plot of the movie. He's literally just an observer of all the stuff that's going on. The plot of the movie is about the rise of Little Z, who is this violent gang lord who essentially takes over all of Rio de Janeiro. He's the one who causes the main conflict of the movie, as well as pushing the plot forward. He's not only the villain of the movie, but he's also the protagonist. The only thing that the main character does is witness him doing this stuff. At one point in the movie, Lil Z ends up really screwing over this one character called Knockout Ned. I'm not going to go into what he does, but Knockout Ned deserves his revenge. Anyway, Knockout Ned ends up opposing Lil Z throughout a large portion of this movie, and he becomes the antagonist of the film, despite the fact that he's the good guy. He's the hero in the movie. But crazy enough, by the end of the movie, he ends up not being a hero anymore, as he gets corrupted by this system that he's in, and he eventually becomes almost as bad as Lil Z. So what you end up getting here is a movie where you have a main character that doesn't do anything towards the plot and literally just witnesses things happen, a protagonist who is also the villain who pushes the plot forward while also creating all the conflicts for other people, and an antagonist who is a hero that eventually becomes corrupted and becomes a villain as well. Like I said, this movie doesn't follow any rules and does not give a fuck about it. But it's also a great example of exactly what I'm talking about here, which is that Kazuya Mishima is a very unorthodox protagonist, but he is still the protagonist of Tekken. And let me be clear about this point again, because apparently I wasn't clear enough. There were a lot of people in the comments who were saying this. When I say that he's the protagonist of the series, I am talking about the Mishima saga. What a What a lot of people were doing in the comments is listing all of the games and then saying who was the protagonist of each individual game without taking into account the entire story that runs through the whole series. For one, even when they did do this, they were still failing, because the only way they could do this and prove that Jin is the protagonist is if they say that he was the protagonist of 4, which he's clearly not. So even if you do it that way, Kazuya is still the protagonist of more games than Jin is. But even so, that doesn't matter, because the Tekken games are not episodic. They're all parts of a greater saga. So Tekken 1, 2, and 3 are actually pretty episodic. Like, you can pretty much look at those games in a vacuum for the most part. But Tekken 4 and on, you can no longer do that. Those are not individual stories at that point. That's one story where each one leads into the next. Tekken 4 and onward, all of them are telling the exact same story about Kazuya rising in power on his quest for world domination. That's what all the games are about. Everything that happens in those games, for the most part, there are a couple of things, are all due to Kazuya. Kazuya's escape from G Corporation causes Heihachi to kidnap Jin, because Heihachi needs power so that he can stop Kazuya. Kazuya then uses that to his advantage to try and steal Jin's power so he can become even more powerful than he already is. This starts a fight. Jin beats both of them and leaves. Next game starts and Kazuya and Heihachi are attacked by G Corporation. G Corporation blows up the building, and that's what makes Jinpachi escape. Why did G Corporation attack them in the first place, blow up the building and wake up Jinpachi? Because Kazuya escaped their facility. Kazuya then goes on a quest to hunt down G Corporation and kill all of their executives so he could take over the company, while Jin decides to fight Jinpachi because he's escaped and no one's going to stop him. In this game, both of these characters are protagonists. Jin defeats Jinpachi and his story ends. Kazuya's story cuts off about 70% of the way through that story mode. Then continues in Tekken 6, where he plays the role of the hero going after Jin, who is now trying to conquer the world. Lars is in that story as the main character who is seeing all of this happen from his perspective, and we follow his plot of also trying to stop Jin. So in Tekken 6, Lars is the protagonist and main character, while Jin is the villain, and Kazuya plays the role of a hero but also a side character. Well, he's more of an anti-hero. While he is trying to stop World War III and defeat Jin, who's trying to awaken Azazel, he's doing it for selfish reasons. But Tekken 6 is the first game in the franchise since Tekken 3 where he did not have a main protagonist role. Then in Tekken 7, Jin's not there, and then the protagonist is taken over by both Kazuya and Heihachi, and both these characters undergo a quest to try and kill each other. So it's kind of hard to label one of them a protagonist and the other one an antagonist. It would be closer to comparing it to something like Rush, where it's a story about the two rivals racing and you can't really give either of them sole role of protagonist. So if you want to count it up like some people have been doing, then you have Kazuya being the protagonist of 1, 4, 5, and 7. Jin is the protagonist of 3 and 5 solely, and Heihachi is the protagonist of 2 and 7. But again, you can't do that because it's not episodic. It's a saga. It's one story that's going from 1 to 7, and that story ends in 7, and 8 will pick up on a new story. And in that story of the Mishima Saga, which is the quest of Kazuya to take out Heihachi and dominate the world, you can't remove Kazuya from the story and still have a story. If you remove Kazuya from the series completely, just rip him out, the only stories that are even possible are Tekken 3 and 6. If you do the same thing to Jin and remove him from the story, all you're doing is removing a bunch of side stories. Remove Kazuya from Tekken 4, you don't have a game. Remove Kazuya from Tekken 5, G Corporation never attacks and Jinpachi never awakens. This is not the case with Jin because he is a passive character. He reacts to the things that happens around him. He doesn't push forward and move plot. He reacts to the plot that other characters push forward. Let's do a thought exercise real quick, alright? Let's imagine that Tekken is not 7 games, but instead it's just one long game, or one long movie, or one long book. It is one story put into one package. What is that story about? Who's the protagonist of that story? What happens in that story? This here is where I think that the whole Jin is the protagonist of the franchise argument completely falls apart. Because what ends up happening then is that you have one story that starts in Tekken 1 and ends in Tekken 7. And it runs across every single game in between. That's the main plot. Then you have a bunch of temporary side stories that happen throughout that plot. Tekken 3 and the stuff that happens with Ogre, the Jinpachi storyline, the Azazel storyline. Those are all breaks to the main larger plot that runs through the entire series, the Mishima Saga. That is the story of this game. Every single one of Jin's major stories is just a break from the main story, which has always been the Mishima Saga. That is my issue with saying that Jin is the protagonist of the series, because the only time in the entire series where he was even slightly involved with the main plot of the games, which is the Kazuya and Heihachi stuff, is in 4. After that, all of his stuff is side content. It doesn't matter how much screen time he gets, doesn't matter how many bosses he beats, doesn't matter how much better of a dude he is, none of these arguments stand up, because at the end of the day, his plot lines run alongside the main plot. he does not drive the main plot. Jin is not the protagonist of this series. He has been a protagonist in individual games, but Kazuya is the protagonist. So why does this even matter? If Jin is a main character of the series and is the hero of the series, why am I even making a video talking about Kazuya being the protagonist? Because at the end of the day, isn't it just kind of the wording that I'm arguing over? No. Not really. The reason why this is important, relatively speaking, and the reason why I pointed it out, is because the protagonist is the most important character in any given story. There are stories that exist without protagonists. They're very common in student films and short films on YouTube. Stories that have main characters but really no plot and are just kind of boring, purposeless, and don't really go anywhere. The protagonist gives the story that purpose. It gives it a point, a direction, something to do. If you have a main character who's not a protagonist, he's just standing there staring at shit. He's got nothing to do. You need a protagonist to push that plot forward, whether it's the main character or not. And the conclusion that this video and the last one is coming to is that Kazuya is the most important character in the Tekken franchise. At least he is at the moment. Like I said, I don't really know what's going to happen in 8, and it's very possible and even probable that at some point Jin is going to take over as the main protagonist of the series. But that is not the case between Tekken 1 and Tekken 7. Alright, I'm done. I'm not talking about this anymore. The topic's done with. I'm moving on to other things after this, I promise. I hope you like this video, and I'm going to keep making Tekken videos all the way up until Tekken's release, and a couple after Tekken's release. If you want to check them out when they release, please do me a favor, like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and y'all be safe out there, you hear?